Good evening, and welcome to the American Antiquarian Society's public program, Consistent Democracy, The Woman Question and Self-Government in 19th-Century America, with author Leslie Butler. The American Antiquarian Society is located on the tribal ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc community, who remain an active presence here in central Massachusetts. My name is Scott Casper, and I'm the president of the American Antiquarian Society. Our mission is to cultivate a deeper understanding of the American past, grounded in the printed and manuscript materials we've been collecting here for more than 200 years. In addition to welcoming researchers from around the world and right here in Worcester to use our collections, both physical and digital, we host programs like tonight's that provide insights into the past and its resonance for our own day. Tonight's program is part of our series, Women Make History. This program is being recorded, and it'll be available on our YouTube page following the live stream. We thank you for joining us this evening, and as a nonprofit organization, we welcome any support you can provide to keep programs like this going. Welcome to all of you who are here, both in the library and watching on YouTube. And now I'm happy to introduce Leslie Butler, this evening's speaker. Leslie and I first met in the fall of 1998 when we were both Peterson Fellows here at AAS. At that time, she was doing research for what became her first book, called Critical Americans, Victorian Intellectuals and Transatlantic Liberal Reform, which was published in 2007. She's currently Associate Professor of History at Dartmouth and has also taught at University College London and at Occidental College, where she was 2020-2021 Ray Allen Billington Visiting Professor at the Huntington Library. In addition to her fellowships at the AAS and the Huntington, she's held fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Massachusetts Historical Society. As an intellectual historian of 19th century America, Leslie Butler traces ideas in conversation and in context. I especially admire her capacious approach to intellectual history, which is fully on view in her new book, Consistent Democracy, The Woman Question and Self-Government in 19th Century America, which was published last year. This is not just a book about major intellectual figures, although many of them are here, from Margaret Fuller to John Stuart Mill, Alexis de Tocqueville to Catherine Beecher, and many others. It's also about how ideas found their way into wider discourse in newspapers, popular illustrations, and elsewhere. So it is a pleasure to welcome Leslie Butler back to the American Antiquarian Society to share her work.
Thank you, Scott, so much. Thank you all for coming out. It's a big day. I know it's Super Tuesday and State of the Union, so I'm going to try not to compete with those events. So I'll have you home in time for Biden's speech. It's wonderful to be back at American Antiquarian Society, so I really thank Scott, Casper, and Nan Wilburton, and Stephanie Corrigan, who's on here, and Jen Trentley as well for making this all possible. I actually gave, I think, the very earliest talk ever on this project when it was just a twinkle in my eye here at American Antiquarian Society. It was so long ago, I'll just say this, I won't tell you how long ago, but it was so long ago that my children were very young, and my youngest, my third child, turned 19 today. So that's how long ago it was. And the project has evolved in all sorts of ways, but it's kind of nice to have a full circle moment of my first comments and then now that the book is out. And actually, as I was thinking about the talk for here, there's a lot of little Worcester connections that I can't tell you all of them, but there are some, so I'm happy to elaborate later. But I'll start with how I got the title for my book, which I just stole from this book, which is this weird little text from 1858 that was published here in Worcester by Thomas Wentworth Higginson, an abolitionist and women's rights activist who was a resident of Worcester for quite some time. And this book, actually, not a book, it's a pamphlet. And I should say I called for the original today, this afternoon, and did look at it and took some better photographs. So the next time I do give a talk, I will put the American Antiquarian Society with a credit. I'll put the photograph of the actual. It's all frayed and really interesting. But this text is sort of a nice indicator of how the book evolved, exactly along the lines Scott laid out. It really started as a a sort of tidier intellectual history of a group of Anglo-American intellectuals that I was trying to trace. As I was doing the archival work for that, I kept getting drawn to this raucous public discussion around the woman question. It was far more extensive than I think I had realized at all. I also think it was more, I'd say, ideologically nuanced. It wasn't a sort of pro or anti. It was just a big spectrum of opinion. And it was everywhere. Across genres, it was in, as you'll see a little bit today, treatises and travel narratives, advice manuals, etiquette books, sermons, short stories, novels. It was just, all everywhere. So I kind of shifted the book, away from focusing on these movement intellectuals and instead made it, of sort of thinking of the world of public discourse around what 19th century people would have called the woman question. And there are just tons and tons of books, I should say, standalone, but also multiplied enormously by periodical literature. And this project really would not have been possible to do the research I did without digitization. And I used many, many databases, but American Antiquarian Society's historical periodicals collection was an important one for me. So thank you for that digitization effort. In conceptualizing the book around the woman question, as I have up there, I leaned heavily on a book by the European historian Holly Case, who maybe 5-6 years ago wrote a book called The Age of Questions, about the 19th century as an age of questions. That this was a sort of way that the 19th century writers, pundits, intellectuals, thinkers framed problems, ideas to think about, to sort of problematize issues. So the social question, the labor question, the money question, the slavery question, the woman question. And formulating a topic in this way, I tried to think about how public opinion was working here. It really sort of elevated and focused a topic, made it worthy of attention. If you got the question treatment, that was like a legit problem to discuss. And it turned a subject like that into a really decades-long, transnational, highly intertextual, and cross-referential conversation. So books, are referencing books written 15 years earlier, 20 years later. They're kind of in this whole long conversation that you could jump into at any time and know that you were part of this woman question conversation. So that's one of the consequences of that of formulating a problem in that way. Another consequence of formulating in that way is that it does constrain the scope of the topic sometimes. It's like sort of these well-worn grooves that you can kind of write about and argue in. And I think that is extremely clear in something like the woman question, because it really, sort of centers on this doubly false singular, right? There is no one woman, even though the 19th century loved to say that, right? The woman question, the problem of woman and her sphere, as if there was a unitary woman. And of course, there's no one question, right? I mean, there's many, many questions. So there's a kind of way that it can flatten, that X question formulation can kind of flatten conversations too. So as I began reading all this material, obviously not every single thing, but I read an enormous amount of stuff, and some of it was stuff and some of it was, quite elaborate. I began to see that woman questions were democracy questions. And this is another reason why this text is useful, because it has that in the very title. And by that, I mean that as Americans and foreigners, as they discussed women's rights and responsibilities, they were also thinking through some pretty fundamental aspects of democratic theory. What does it mean to be a democratic people? What does democratic governance mean? How does we practice it? How do we think about it? And here I want to emphasize, when I say that, I don't just mean democracy as inclusion or exclusion, are women part of it or not part of it, but instead thinking of women questions as democracy questions, I think, gets at a whole set of really open and contested debates and questions that they had about the practice of democracy. Questions, revolving around mobilization. How do you organize for change? Public opinion, the ballot, associations. Women were really central to all those conversations. Key questions around political socialization, what political theorists would call political socialization. How do we learn to become democratic citizens? Is it through newspapers? Is it through associations? Is it through the family? Does the family play this important role in not just educating children, but in modeling certain kind of democratic norms? So these are really live debates throughout the 19th century. And then perhaps most interesting to me was really questions surrounding the full range of meanings of self-government. What does self-government mean? it's a synonym. We may think of it as a synonym for democracy, and it is, but it's really a way, like I started to think about the way that writers thought about what it actually meant to govern oneself, and then what the relationship was between the individual process of governing oneself and the collective process of self-government. And I started to see this everywhere. And I really see this kind of self-government discourse as the pivot around which women question debates kind of turned. It was a way of uniting women in their different identities as individuals, as members of family households, and as constituents of the body politic. It kind of gathered all those different identities of women. And this, when you think about self-governing, I think it's where we can see that unitary category of woman most obviously break down, right? There's a real range of experience of actual 19th century women vis-a-vis self-government. It's probably clearer there than anywhere, that real distinction there from enslaved women who were, of course, subjected to the governance of others, right? Denied the ability to control and regulate their own personhood. And a range of experiences in between for free women of color, working class women, Irish American women, constantly subjected to doubts about their own abilities to self-govern, right? Could they be self-governing? Then we might think about the difference between single women and married women. All married women, regardless of your race, social status, religion, region, anything, were barred from, were lived under the governance of household heads via common law doctrine, right? So even there was a kind of other governance of sorts, which in theory protected them, but still there was a barrier to self-government there. And then all women, regardless of status, marital status, or racial status, were of course barred from participation in the collective process of self-government, right? They were barred from the ballot, except for the exception in New Jersey, which ends in 1807. There's a little moment when some single women are voting in New Jersey, but that's over by 1807. So that's kind of how I started to conceptualize things, and it led me to a different point of departure for the story than a movement narrative might have. And that really came about, I started to look closely at this moment in the 1830s when dozens and dozens of foreign observers come to study American democracy. So Alexis de Tocqueville would be the best known of these writers. He's not alone, but he's one of them. And they wrote lengthy analyses of American democratic society, politics, culture, right? Very, very wide-ranging tomes, multiple volumes. And their works in these big tomes, and it's not just, I'll show you a couple more people in just a second. Tocqueville, John Stuart Mill, who doesn't visit but writes a lot about America. Harriet Martineau is another figure. They work through a cluster of ideas together. There are about 6-7 books that come out in a 5-year period that really starts to think through, questions of democratic citizenship, the meaning of self-government, whether or not family life was conducive to democracy. Did marriage look different under democratic government or not? Did it look like the old world? Did it look different? And I really see these writers as structuring the debate for years to come, for decades to come. There's a kind of agenda setting, I think the social scientists call it sometimes agenda setting, but there's also a sort of vocabulary introducing element to some of what they're doing. So I'm just going to move quickly through this, but I am happy to elaborate later. But Tocqueville most famously, or most importantly, I think for my purposes, is really writing about the transformative impact that political participation has on the citizen. There's a kind of educative component to just taking part in democracy. So we learn to be democratic by doing democracy, right? We do stuff, and then that's how we learn how to be self-governing. He also has, in his second volume in 1840, he dedicates about 5 chapters to family and women. And in that, he tries to think through the fact that marriage is maybe not super egalitarian, the man is in charge and the husband's in charge and the wife is not, but he tries to think through how is this kind of democratic too. It's not super satisfying to people in the 21st century, but lots of people found it very convincing. This is just one quick quote. Again, it's 5 chapters, so. But you can see there, Americans don't suppose that one consequence of democratic principles is the subversion of marital power, or the confusion of the natural authorities in the family, right? They don't confuse that. They don't think democracy has to extend there. They maintain that in the smaller association of husband and wife, as well as in the great social community, the object of democracy is to regulate and legalize the powers that are necessary, not to subvert all power. So that's one thing he does. This is like just some of the language that I will see, you'll see for decades cropping up. John Stuart Mill, who kind of began as the cornerstone of this project in some ways, he reviews Tocqueville, the first volume actually, but he reviews it, and in that he has this footnote in the review. It's about a 40, 50-page review, very long review, and in it, I won't read the whole thing, but just draw your eye to the last sentence there, right? In the American democracy, the aristocracy of skin and the aristocracy of sex retain their privileges. So he's puzzling through, what's new about democracy, what's not new, and for him, what's new is that in a world that proclaims itself dedicated to consent of the governed, that claims it has universal suffrage, this kind of new aristocracy stands out, right? It doesn't stand out in an actual aristocracy, because there are all kinds of inequalities, but it stands out in this country. Another writer who comes right around the same time, so these are all clustered in this period, is Harriet Martineau, very different figure from Alexis de Tocqueville. She is a sort of more middle-class English reformer. She comes sort of well-known already as a writer. And she, and so I've used these actually in the book. This is why they're not like the best images. I mean, there are better looking portraits of her, but I wanted to use the images I have in the book. The point being that they actually circulated in the American press, so these were very well-known figures. So this is from 1850, and in the book, I actually, like, the caption of this says, "Oh, she needs no introduction. Everyone knows who she is." So this is, familiar to readers in 1850. Here's a quote from her in a chapter that gets quoted endlessly and excerpted, and you just sort of see it all over the place, sometimes with a hyphen, sometimes without the hyphen. The chapter's on the political non-existence of women. It's a really wide-ranging chapter. But here you can see this same sort of thing as Mill in a way, right? The most principled democratic writers on government have on this subject sunk into fallacies as disgraceful as any advocate of despotism has adduced, right? There's a way that when it comes to thinking about women, Democrats become despots, she's arguing there, right? I won't read the whole thing because we don't need to do that. So these figures became really important, but it wasn't just their books, it was the just enormous response that these books generated. And I just put a slide up here to show you a bunch of different things, but I mean, this is just 4 and there's like hundreds. So, there are standalone response to Mill. This is a pamphlet-length response anonymously published. John Stuart Mill's response to Mill, not response, but book review, it's a 40, 50-page book review. That gets published as a pamphlet, standalone pamphlet. And then in every periodical, newspaper, and what's interesting to me is it enters it sort of brings the woman question discussion to readers who might not have encountered it via abolition, which is a radical movement. This is a much more mainstream conversation in a way, so more people are being exposed. Even if these reviews are disagreeing with them, they're being exposed to the ideas. So it's sort of entering into the lifeblood, I guess you'd say, of the culture. And just to sort of give you one example, this is a pretty famous example, but Catherine Beecher's best-selling book, her treatise on domestic economy, which is sort of like, Martha Stewart and Oprah and who's the Spock, what to expect when you're expecting, I don't know, whatever books you can think about, parenting, children, housekeeping, everything. It's like all that in one, right? It's the craziest text. I really encourage people to look at it. It's really, really wide-ranging, from how to plant herbs to calisthenics. She actually introduces the word calisthenics to American audiences. It is in print every year until after the Civil War, so it's just an enormously popular book. What's interesting about it, for my purposes, is that the introduction of the book, about 10 pages long, fully 5 pages of them are devoted to Alexis de Tocqueville. And she's framing her project in terms of what Alexis de Tocqueville has said about wives and women and marriage. So this just seems so curious. Again, I didn't discover this, people know this, but as I really started to think through it, I thought this is really odd. Like, why is this domestic economy book so invested in thinking with Tocqueville? So this just shows you the conversations everywhere. I'm not going to march you through every chapter, so I'm going to skip ahead, but I just thought I would, a movement does emerge in the late 40s and 50s, a women's rights movement. That's going to make the conversation even more robust. You're going to see commentary everywhere, including in images. This is one that Nate photographed for me. Thank you, Nate, for the book. And this is a detail from a much larger sheet on women's rights. So I just wanted this one image. And it kind of shows, here we have women at the polls. It's called Women's Rights at the Polls, and they are these brawling, fighting politicians. So it's, kind of conjuring up the worst features maybe of democratic electoral politics, and then imagining what would happen to women in them. A fairly conventional idea, but it's put very vividly, I think, in illustration here. Okay, so again, I'm gonna fast forward. So let me fast forward, just in the interest of time, to the post-emancipation period. So after 1865, after the Civil War, slavery has ended, and really woman question discussions just skyrocket. The period between 65 and 75, there was one point when I was writing this book that I thought, I should just write the whole book on this. I have so much material. And it was hard to, I was like writing chapters that were differentiating 67 from 68. That's how much material there was. Obviously, I didn't do that, but that would have been kind of a tedious read. But anyway, the conversations are everywhere. I mean, and if you, I don't know, the people, Google Ngram is a very suspect category, but you can sort of see that, if you do a little Google Ngram search, you can see the usage of a word. The phrase woman question just jumps up in these years. It's just everywhere. So I'm going to kind of tick through some things. Oh yeah, here's a quote from Harriet Beecher Stowe writing in 1866. This question of woman, again, unitary woman and her sphere is now perhaps the greatest of the age. And there's a sense that, slavery, we've ended slavery, this is now the issue. John Stuart Mill says something just like that. So you're going to see, women question debates are going to be really important surrounding the 15th Amendment, which, we think of as the Black Suffrage Amendment, right, Black manhood suffrage. But you see it everywhere. These same conversations about marriage and family and political socialization are accompanying the discussions just on voting. So I'll just tick through some of these things quickly. I know this is really hard to see. There are dozens of these 15th Amendment sort of celebrations, these beautiful lithographs that you would hang in your wall and whatnot. This one in particular I really like, by James C. Beard, because it actually has women as sort of part of the story of democratic citizenship. So I want to make sure I get the quotes right on this. There is, liberty protects the marriage altar, right? So thinking about the ability of enslaved people, now that they're no longer enslaved, to actually get to marry. There's women as a school teacher there, right? So that quote is, education will prove the equality of the races. And then there's a little picture up there on all the way in the corner of freedom unites the family circle. So family being really part of this story. In these same moments, if you think about this late 60s, early 70s, John Stuart Mill publishes The Subjection of Women, which is probably the most important 19th century feminist text, right? We've got Mary Wollstonecraft for the 18th century, maybe Simone de Beauvoir in the 20th century, and Mill for the middle century there. Just a really, really important work. He's a a theorist of liberal political economy. He wrote On Liberty in 1859, and now he dedicates his attention to the question of women. He's also, the reason that he would have been a well-known figure in Harper's Weekly, his engraving published, is that he was actually a supporter of the Union during the Civil War. So he comes to this topic with a lot of attention and focus and expectation on him. And so he publishes this book, and the response is just over the top. It's like the book of the, it's the book of the year. It's the book of the century. So here's just a few, three sort of, full book length responses in part. They're not strictly responses. This one is by Carlos White. It says, an examination of arguments in favor of female suffrage by John Stuart Mill. This one by Horace Bushnell, really important clergyman, intellectual, is written a little bit before, but he knows it's coming and he has an idea about the book, and so he's kind of writing almost to refute it in advance. And then this one, we'll be looking at images from this book. This is a really interesting, strange, bizarre book, but it has just chapters and chapters devoted to refuting John Stuart Mill's subjection of women. So again, I'm going to move a little bit quickly through these, but another figure we might think of is Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, really important abolitionist, a poet, a novelist. Her biographer, or William Still, writes a little biography of her in which he tells us she's a reader of Tocqueville and Mill. So there's a little connection here. She's giving speeches about, they're not necessarily about democracy, although she does talk about a truer democracy, but she's really thinking through marriage, actually. What does marriage look like? I love this novel. many sacrifice, in part because it's, it's sort of repeating speeches that she's making, but it's also a novel about a marriage and conversations between husband and wife. But you can see there, she's thinking there about the broadest basis of suffrage, right? The nation makes a great mistake. Like, now we have this chance to have this new birth of freedom. We make a great mistake if we make it partial, right? When they're reconstructing the government, why not lay the whole foundation anew and base the right of suffrage not on the claims of service or sex, but on the broader basis of our common humanity? This little periodical, which is in the American Antiquarian Society Historical Periodicals collection, is also a real gem of a source, I will say. I haven't really read much about it, and I spent some time with it. It only lasts for 3 years, but it's basically dedicated to opposing a proposed 16th Amendment. So after the 15th Amendment gets ratified, passed in Congress and ratified, there's efforts to have a 16th Amendment, which uses similar language for women, what will become the 19th Amendment, right? But a 16th Amendment gets read on the floor of Congress. And this paper, gets formed really to combat that. They actually, this petition, you can see the word petition, they actually have a petition that they are encouraging people to sign. Godey's Ladies book publishes it and encourages women to cut it out and have other women sign it to say, please don't give us the vote, please don't have a 16th Amendment. This is one of these interesting things about the women's movement, is that it's not a universal. And then, I just want to kind of think through, and then the editor, sorry, Charles, no, she's not on there. No, she's not on this one. Charlotte McKay is the editor. And in that, she both thinks that enfranchising women will imperil the family, right? There'll be a sort of social disorder. But she also, and you can hear this in a lot of the slides I'm going to show you, will make this case as well. She feared that such a move would, quote, imperil the safety of the republic by an immense increase of the unintelligent and the incompetent vote. And a lot of this argument is really saying, when we say women's suffrage, we mean all women. And so there's that kind of, sort of an anti-democratic element that's not really about women as women, but about women as certain categories of women, right? Free people of color, Irish American, working class, whatever you want to say there. So then, and I have a bunch of illustrations. I know illustrations are a lot more fun in a presentation like this. I read text, so it's not very fun to just show you the text. Although it's even worse if I don't show you the text, right? So I have to show you something. But I have a bunch of illustrations, and they're a lot more fun. So let me show you some of these. This is going to get at a fairly conventional opposition, right, to women's full inclusion in the body politic. It's sort of two slides that are telling two sides of the story. One, the wife and mother at a primary. And she probably looks like a nice, fine person to you, but in 19th century terms, she's like a very scoldy, fierce, angry woman. It's a type, and everybody recognized it at the time. So she's at the primary haranguing, as is that person over there. And then here is the father at home, attending to the chaos of having to put his kids to bed, right? Babysitting, right? When the dad babysits, yeah. Okay, so there's that one. This one was a really fun find in Godey's Ladies book because it actually names the 16th Amendment, so I was kind of excited by that. So this is from 1870, same idea, right? There's the wife out there reading Subjection of Women, is my theory. I don't know that's true, but I like to pretend that. So she's out there reading a book, having a read, and here he is cooking and dealing with the dog or cat, unclear, and the baby, and the chaos of domestic life, because of course wives have abandoned it to go vote or prepare to vote. So that gives you some of the ideas about gender and gender relations and social order based on families that people felt were threatened by a full, consistent democracy. But then there's also the illustrations that make this sort of more anti-democratic point. And this one is, other historians have used this image. It's not wasn't a huge find for me, but it does make the point very nicely. A modern Cornelia is kind of just a riff on the Roman story of Cornelia, the matron Cornelia, who is the mother of the Gracchus brothers, and a well-heeled woman comes over to her house and says, look at all my finery, where are your jewels? And she says, these are my jewels, and she points to her sons. So that's kind of the riff of the story, the origin of the story. So here is the modern Cornelia. She's a veritable Roman, playing around with Roman, but of course she's a drunken, that's also coded Irish American. You can see the store front. She's in front of gin, rum, and brandy, and she is labeled universal suffrage. And these are her children, right? The modern Cornelia. These are my jewels. Sorry, these are my jewels. Her children are her jewels. Her children are female suffrage, right? Kind of has a vaguely Susan B. Anthony look. which is also a stereotype from the era. And then, of course, Negro suffrage, which is a highly caricatured, very unfavorable image as well. And so, it's sort of like her universal suffrage is a problem, and then her progeny are also problems, right, for this artist. And then the image that's on the cover of my book, which I was very excited to find, this was not in a periodical, but in an actual book, one of the responses to John Stuart Mill. And I love this image for so many reasons. I mean, not because I agree with it, but I just think it's a really rich image. So it's called Women at the Polls. We have a black man who looks like he, is an agricultural worker because he's not wearing a jacket, right? He's in shirt sleeves. Behind him is that stereotypical sort of angry white middle class woman. And then we have, interestingly, if you see back here, an Irish American washerwoman, right, domestic, and an African American woman dressed similarly. And it's the only picture I found. I was telling Scott earlier, I'm not going to pretend I've seen everything for sure, but I did look very hard. It's the only image I found that showed a black woman at the polls, a voting black woman in the 19th century. Lots in the 20th century. So, it's just a funny image. And then there's kind of these middle-class white men over to the side, clearly marginalized by this new world that's come into being. Lest you don't get the message, the publisher was at pains to interpret it for you. So in the publisher's advertisement, he says, the images, the woodcut illustrations were drawn in a dissuasive spirit. They portray a nightmare vision of a hopefully far distant future where women have abandoned the graces and delicacy which currently make them honored and revered only to become brawling politicians. And that's a view that I do see echoed in a lot of, not illustrations, but print. Again, in sort of complicated ways. One is by the writer Gail Hamilton, also known as Mabel Dodge, who really argues for a lot of expanded opportunities for women, expanded rights, expanded economic opportunities, but she draws a really hard line at full inclusion in the body politic. And by her lights, as she says, women's suffrage, she can see that it offers no measure intended to keep the ignorant man away from the polls, only a proposition to enable him to bring his ignorant wife with him. So it's more about hostility to a really true universal suffrage than it is about women. She doesn't have a problem with women's freedoms, but she has a problem with more democracy. So I'm going to kind of sum up here, because I do see that concern about the full implications of democracy, of universal suffrage, of making it consistent, where we apply it consistently to all adults. That ambivalence about that really gains traction in the last decades of the 19th century, which is the last chapters of the book. I sort of, as I was doing the final two drafts of this book, that became it sort of crystallized as a clear through line of American history for me, honestly, that this ambivalence towards democracy is a really ever-present strand, actually. So to sort of do a little summing up here, thinking of women questions as democracy questions, it's a way of accessing democratic and anti-democratic thought. As I mentioned about key questions, these are questions that if you took on democratic theory, you would be studying these. I teach a seminar in democracy. We think a lot about mobilization. How does it work? We think a lot about what are the agents of political socialization? What does that process look like? These are all questions that Americans are thinking through as they read and write and draw illustrations and consume all those things on the women question. And then, again, about the full meaning of self-government and what it meant to really govern oneself and how those things were connected. So I'm going to end there and take some questions or talk to Scott for a little bit. But thank you very much for coming out.
So Leslie, thank you so much.
You're so welcome.
It's a terrific book.
Thank
I recommend
you.
the book
Thank
to
you.
everybody. It's a terrific book. It's a great read, and I think it's quite relevant for our own time.
Possibly.
Yeah, I have a few questions, and then I'm going to open up to the audience both here in the hall and on YouTube. So you mentioned Tocqueville. At the
Yes.
start of chapter 2, this astonished me. You write, more Americans encountered Tocqueville's words via Catherine Beecher's extensive quotations than through any other single channel, because she quoted him at length and because her book was read for decades.
Decades, yeah.
So if that's where Americans got their Tocqueville.
Not exclusively, but more, but Americans who might not have gotten their Tocqueville, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Americans who maybe weren't reading the North American Review
Yeah.
would have encountered it.
Exactly. So what Tocqueville, if they were getting their Tocqueville through Beecher, what Tocqueville were they getting? Were they getting the Tocqueville that we think about in political thought today, or were they getting a Tocqueville that was specifically the stuff Beecher was after?
She's really interested in the chapter on, I forget the exact title of the chapter, but it's something on how Americans understand the true equality between the sexes. And that's like not equality, right? So it's his way, it's a really interesting text. So I don't mean to suggest that like Tocqueville's a bad Democrat or anything like that, but he's really trying to grapple with how is marriage different in the New World? How is it different in America? And for him, it looks quite different from France. It's based on consent. It's voluntary. It's not old aristocratic families, exchanging property or combining property. So for him, it's a very elaborate chapter, but he basically has it's really super interesting. He says, young girls in America are the freest in the world. They have these democratic educations to prepare them for life, and they willingly, the phrase he uses is they willingly take the yoke, the marital yoke, like they take this on, which is a really striking image, but he tries to sort of see it as, no, they precisely because they've been educated and free, they're able to do this. It's a really striking passage, or many, many passages, and Catherine Beecher likes that. That's the Tocqueville that she really likes.
Yeah.
And on how, we have to have this kind of like men do this and women do this, and there's a way, he has this really interesting passages about marriages, like they sort of model consent, they model just authority and obedience to just authority. So there's a way that he sees it as very democratic. It's just not the same kind of democracy as a Harriet Martineau.
Yeah.
So different versions, and that's kind of the point of the book. There is no one version. There never has been one version of democracy. We don't agree on a lot of basics, and we never have.
Right.
That's kind of maybe at essence what it means to be democratic, is to have these disagreements, right?
These disagreements about what democracy is,
Right.
and in a sense, we could have disagreements about what Tocqueville is, because other people were reading
sure.
Tocqueville and picking different chapters as the ones to focus on.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Throughout the book, the story in the book, and you mentioned this at the end, it's to some degree a story about a rise and fall.
Yeah.
The rise of the idea that women's roles and rights ought to be consistent with American ideas about democracy and self-government, government by the people, also government of the self, and then the decline of those ideas in tandem after Reconstruction, when Americans North and South are kind of backing away from democracy. And I'm wondering about the direction in which these ideas flowed. That is, in both cases, to what degree were the arguments about women's roles and rights generated by notions of democracy, and then the ideas of anti-suffrage and so on was generated by the contraction of ideas about democracy, whether it's always flowing in one direction, or do ideas about women's rights also kind of drive ideas about democracy?
No, that's a great question. And I don't think it's always going in one direction. I think it works in both. And one of the elements of the work, the research that I found really interesting is that it's not a good guy, bad guy story, right? There aren't like uncomplicatedly good Democrats and then uncomplicated. I don't even, like, who am I to assign that title to people, right? I mean, that's not what I'm trying to do. So even the people who are most out there, in very radical terms on lots of issues, have limits to their democracy, right? They also are the ones who are sometimes harboring these ideas about ignorant, uneducated, the wrong kinds of voters. I mean, democracy's tough. And actually, one of the things about reading Tocqueville, I think, is you think about it. We take it for granted now. I say at one point in the book, it's kind of the wallpaper of our lives. Reading Tocqueville, and when I teach it, I think students really see this. He's really grappling with this like kind of world historic transition from an old world system to this new world system, and trying to think through all the consequences of it. And it's not for the faint of heart. It's a big deal, right? I mean, it's trusting people that you don't agree with. It's trusting people that you don't know, maybe, and saying like, it's okay, you're 51%, we'll get it next time. It's a tough proposition, I think, and you can see the strains throughout. Even the people who are writing the consistent democracy pamphlet are actually not consistent in lots of ways, right? They're consistent when it's convenient to them and not when it's not convenient to them. So I think you can see, if you're looking for it, you can see the kind of elements of the ambivalence, right? But there are moments when that ambivalence, I think, really does gain traction. And that will then have consequences for talking about women's rights. So it's like if the culture is sort of like, we don't want that, it's going to be harder to make the case for another big expansion of the electorate, if that makes sense.
And whether we're talking about women or in the late 19th century, Chinese Americans and immigration, thinking of the immigration questions and who can even come to the United States, let alone vote.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then add into that, I mean, the stuff on Mill's that's not really a suffrage text, subjection of women. I mean, he's consistently saying, from his work in the 40s and 50s that as many people as possible should always be included in an electorate. Those inconsistencies there too when it comes to the British Empire. But it's really more about families and household governance and about being other governed in a household and about sort of, in the really interesting way he does is when I talk about political socialization, what he's really arguing in Subjection of Women is that we are socializing people through families, which he accepts with Tocqueville, with Beecher. The family is a major unit of political socialization. We're socializing them right now into hierarchy and inequality. And there's a way that that's not going to be a good thing. That they're raised in a household. Everybody is raised in a household of inequality, of gaps in education, gaps in opportunity, and that's sort of forming the citizen. Actually, is to grow up in that household. You're being formed to tolerate those kinds of gaps, and that's no way to create a free society and an equal society.
Were they thinking about both gaps and inequality within the household and also gaps across households? I mean, the gaps within the household, the democratic household, kind of implies whiteness, middle classness, and all kinds of other things. What about the families that are not even part of that circle? Were they looking at those families?
I mean, some of the domestic advice texts from, like in the Beecher mode from the 40s, are pretty explicitly kind of ruling out all kinds of people, that they are not capable of creating households that are democratic. Like, it's 19th century America. That's not for the faint of heart. There's some rough stuff. And so they're just kind of, ruling people out. It is very much for a lot of these, right? I mean, it's hard to make huge generalizations. There are more egalitarian figures as well. But in the domestic advice genre, there is, the Black Press has a version of it, which is the Free Black Press in the North, which is, an increasingly vital public space. I mean, starting in the late 1820s, but every decade thereafter, it's a bigger and bigger audience. And there is a free Black version of domesticity, so that is and that's really combined with a kind of anti-slavery impulse. So there would be a much more egalitarian version of this. But no, a lot of that literature is really confined to white middle class. People. Yeah.
And in the Black community in the North, you've got the colored conventions movement, where you're seeing a lot of these debates about democracies happening among African Americans in the same context.
Yeah, and the women's rights movement and the colored convention movement are these really, really wonderfully, I mean, I think those texts are fabulous. All those proceedings for these conventions were published. Derek Spires has a great book on the colored convention. There's also a great website that Gabby Foreman and others have built on the colored convention. My students use this all the time. You can read all the speeches, you can find out who was there, and so it's a really great primary source to get into not just what intellectuals are thinking, but people who showed up at a meeting and what they heard, the speeches they heard. And they are happening at the same time. 40s I think for the women, for the colored convention movement, 50s for the women's rights conventions.
You draw a distinction in the book between what you call published opinion and public opinion. So a lot of what you're focusing on, as you describe it, is published opinion. And it's really key to your method. This is how you trace ideas moving through print, not just in books and pamphlets, but the newspapers and the images. Seems like this is a method that really is a relatively newer method of intellectual history because so many sources are available and searchable in ways they weren't 15 or 20 years ago.
Absolutely. Yeah, and public opinion is a problematic category today even. Like, public opinion thinks this or that. But it's maybe especially so, in an era before polling. I mean, it's hard to generalize ever about public opinion. So I didn't want to use that term ever. I mean, not never, but I didn't want to say, well, public opinion was against this or public. So I came up with that phrase, published opinion, to sort of, suggest that this is not a category that is representative of the public in any way. Not everyone had access to print, right? So this is people who could get their work published. And that it doesn't have the coherence maybe that public opinion has. But I think your point is really right. I mean, I was able to find like little, it's amazing what you can find with digitization. You see someone quote something and you Google it and you're like, this whole other rabbit hole. I mean, my husband's in the audience, he can attest to the rabbit holes we went down finding stuff. Like, if someone misquotes it, I mean, you find someone like misquote slightly John Stuart Mill, but then you see the misquote 10 more times, and it's fascinating. It's fun with digitization.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, it does make possible a lot of connections that I wouldn't. You definitely would have been able to come across a lot of them, but it would have been a little more happenstance rather than deliberate. Political non-existence. You'd be excited if you saw political non-existence. Here's a funny story of the digitization. The Consistent Democracy pamphlet itself, which is such a weird text because it's like 4 pages long. It's these little paragraphs from all men, right, by 25 prominent men. And then it also has 2 little excerpts, one from the Wisconsin legislature and then the Ohio Senate, I think. And in the Ohio Senate one, I recognized a quote from Harriet Taylor, that's John Stuart Mill's wife, from a text that she writes about the Worcester Convention in 1850. And so she's not named in that text, but it is her. So she's quoted without attribution. So it's actually 24 prominent men and 1 British woman in that text. But she just doesn't have attribution. They just took it, I mean, as the 19th century did.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. But yeah, I would never have, well, actually I would have, because I did recognize the quote in that case, but you could then have searched it and found out where else they might have gotten it from.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Let's open this up to our audience here in Worcester and also our audience on YouTube. Please, if you have a question, raise your hand. Nan Wolverton will bring a mic to you. Stephanie Corrigan is in the back monitoring our YouTube chat, and has a mic to have questions coming from YouTube as well. We have one in the back.
So I was struck by the picture that you had there of women voting in a primary. I believe that was dated 1870, which is before primaries were really a thing, right? At the time they were used every once in a while in some of the states. So it seems to me like part of the story that's being told here is that by opponents of suffrage is that politics is a dirty business. Mm-hmm. And that if women engage in politics, they'll be corrupted by it, right? They too will become the kind of people who go to conventions and brawl and so on. Yeah. So I'm wondering about the timing here. Politics gets cleaned up a little bit in the late 19th century. You have the Australian ballot, and then you have the direct primary introduced in the early 20th century. Does that change the conversation? It seems like somebody could look and say, well, politics is not as terrible as it used to be, so maybe now it is clean enough that women can get involved. Is that sort of what happens?
Yeah, no, that's a really great observation. So I don't do the 20th century, so I will not answer that specifically. But you may say, well, it is not till 1920 that the 19th Amendment gets passed, so maybe there's a piece to that. There is a whole conversation about voter apathy around that time, right? And especially about white voters. Like that voter apathy is really like hidden. Leah Gidlow has written this great book called The Big Vote on this, everyone's really worried about voter turnout and voter apathy, but they're really specific voters aren't voting. So I will say that. The other thing I would say is not everybody has that dirty view of politics. So, I mean, one of the threads I try to trace that I do trace to Tocqueville, and Mill does this. Mill is very influenced by Tocqueville's view of politics, which again is this kind of, this educative power we get from just engaging in. So it's not about politics in DC, but just local self-government. As you engage in local self-government, you're kind of transformed. You start to see things differently. You see your neighbors differently. And for someone like Tocqueville and his wife, Harriet Taylor, that's so important, and they believe that so much that they think to debar half the population, as they'd say, to prevent women from engaging in that process is really a missed opportunity, and actually then will make those inequalities in the family even worse. So there is an alternate vision of politics. Again, it's not necessarily what's happening in the seats of Congress, but it is, more sort of local stuff. But I don't know. I mean, even when politics gets cleaned up, and the Australian ballot introduces its own, problems as well in terms of who's prevented from being able to read the bureaucratic ballot. I teach a class on voting, on the culture of voting, as well as the rights of voting, and when I show them ballots are really pretty. We were talking about this at dinner. Ballots are pretty and fun and colorful in the 19th century. And then the Australian ballot comes, and it's very hard to read. It has so many words. Think about the butterfly ballot. It's kind of like you're voting by party sometimes, and sometimes not by party, but by office. They're complicated. And so there's cleaning it up is one way of putting it, but it also introduces a whole other set of issues into electoral politics. But yeah, I don't know that there's ever a time when people really feel like politics is not grubby, and that's really unfortunate, actually. I mean, we live in a moment right now when people don't have a really high opinion, and of what it takes to actually govern democratically, which means compromise and losing some and winning some, and yeah. So, but it's a great observation. So, thank you.
A question from YouTube, Stephanie.
Marcia Schmidt-Blaine asks, how much did all the discussion of the dangers to democracy did it influence your final drafts?
That's such a good question. I started my NEH, which was a writing fellowship for a whole year. I got a whole year off from teaching in January of 2017. So I'll let you do the math about that one. It did, things started to get a little darker, I felt a little darker generally. And of course, every 6 months was a new social science book about the demise of democracy, democratic, all these sorts of problems about democracy. So it wasn't irrelevant. And yet the story was the story and the sources were the sources. I maybe fastened on them a little more and kind of, sought them out a little more than I might have. Especially because in the earlier iterations of the really long ago iterations of the book, I was kind of trying to trace out this more movement story, which was somewhat more democratic. And what I was really interested in, it's kind of like the slavery issue. We know the abolitionists, we know the pro-slavery ideology, and then there's all these people in the middle, right, who we maybe don't study as much. And I felt like something very similar was going on. I'm looking at you, but I guess I should be looking at something else. I'm looking at Stephanie, I'm answering your question, Stephanie. Same with on women's rights. It's like we have the most extreme women's rights activists. We have the very clear opponents, but then we have all these people in the middle, and a lot of people kind of lived in the middle there. And there's some really great texts that I read that were sort of I want to be on the right side of history. It feels really quick. I started to think about opinion and how a sort of culture works very much in today's terms. I started to think about trolls. I thought about permission structures. There are definitely 19th century figures who function as what we would call trolls today. They're just stirring the pot and being provocative. And then there are other moments in which an important periodical runs, a series of articles on is Negro suffrage a failure, and they don't use the phrase, but they're basically accusing that periodical of creating a permission structure, as we would say today, for other people to question Negro suffrage, right? So I did start to think a lot about, today, you want to be careful about doing too much of that, but I definitely, some of the questions, not just around the crisis of democracy, but about how media works, I think became kind of important to me thinking through a very different media moment.
Was there any party preference, one party or the other, for or against women's suffrage? Was there one party that was really pushing it and one party opposed, or did it transcend parties?
Yeah, that's a really great story. There's lots of really good scholarship on, and it's kind of different in different moments, but there's a really nice book that came out by Lauren Hamisser just 2 years ago, I think, called Democratic Collapse on, so this would be the Republicans and the Democrats early 1850s, and neither the Republican Party nor the Democratic Party was for women's suffrage, but the Republican Party definitely, like the Whigs before them, was a little more family-friendly, women-friendly. The Democratic Party very much became an explicit party identification as white men. And another book by Michael Pearson sort of looks at all these newspapers, and the Democratic newspapers are publishing these stories about white patriarchs who are, facing challenges and then restore order, and the Republican Party is just a little more friendly to having women involved in conventions and thinking about, their slogan, free labor, free soil, free labor, free men, free homes is the phrase they use too. So they are definitely friendlier, and by the time of the 1860 election, certainly the women's rights activists who are meeting in convention every year, starting in 1850 in Worcester, National Convention, they are by 56, 57, 58. They're saying very nice things about the Republican Party, even though the Republican Party is not putting a clear, it's not putting any plank in their platform explicitly on women's rights, but they definitely are seen as friendlier. It's the party of anti-slavery, and these things are all coded together in the 1850s. And then later in the century, certainly the radical Republicans are the closest women's rights activists. They're the ones, many of them. They come up through abolition and women's rights really do go together. So not as a party, but as individuals, they're really important. And I can't think off the top of my head of any Democrats who are doing that in the 19th century. It's really, being the party of white men is really kind of baked into the Democratic cake in the 19th century.
Question up here.
I noticed the Ohio and the Wisconsin legislature things. Anti-slavery seems the center of mass was New England and New York. Did the center of mass move at all?
Ohio is a real hotbed of anti-slavery activism. Ohio is a big state, and there's sort of southern pieces of it, I suppose. But Oberlin College is founded as an anti-slavery college. Actually, first college to admit women as well. Again, because these things go together. So no, there's a lot of activism in Ohio. Yeah, and that is interesting. Wisconsin, I don't know as well, but I find that super interesting in that document because they're actually debating in the Senate, the floor of the Senate, and that's maybe another thing that's so weird about that Consistent Democracy pamphlet is that they're not the most compelling passages from people. Like, even people I know, Higginson is a great writer on this question. He's actually one of the great voices on this. He's pithy, he's elegant, he's funny. He kind of, has his finger on the pulse of a lot of things. It's a really bland passage that he quotes from himself. But one of the things I was going to say is that in Ohio and Wisconsin, they're probably not, I can't remember, I may be wrong, but they're probably saying things that are more like women should have rights and not maybe being as explicit. I'd have to look back. But this is also this moment, the 40s and the 50s, is a moment when these common law doctrines are getting remodeled, so that women, it's called coverture, right? Women can't own property, they don't have custody of their children. This all comes from common law, English common law. And there's a real crisis in the 40s and 50s where people start to say, that doesn't seem to suit a democratic nation, that we have this inheritance of common law. So they do things on the state level, like passing married women's property laws, right? Passing laws about, divorce in some places, custody of children, that kind of thing. So it may be that they didn't, I know the pamphlet is on suffrage, but it may have been a more tepid quote. I'd have to look back at it, but there is activism happening all over in the 50s. 50s is a little bit understudied, I think, on some of this, on some of the women's rights stuff. I feel like we spent so much time in the post-Civil War period, the schism and all of that. In the 1850s, how it shapes politics is, I've mentioned this book called The Democratic Collapse by Lauren Helmuser, but I think that's really ripe for a lot more study, actually.
All over, but not in the South?
Not so much.
Not so
there
much
are some property rights elements for maybe not proto-feminist reasons, but more about maintaining property and how it passes from, property in slaves passes from fathers to daughters and gets protected from sons-in-law. So there are some exceptions of southern states fairly quickly, but not necessarily in a proto-feminist way.
Yeah.
Other questions here?
Thank you. Enjoyed the talk. And I apologize if anything I ask is in the book.
Well, I hope something of it is in the book.
Well, that
if you're asking questions that I don't have any answers to, you're going to have to apologize.
That I would just be better served reading it, which I will. I kind of want to go back to the schism a little bit, or your kind of declensionist narrative that you were talking about. So my understanding of the late 19th century is similar, right? Like that it's dark. There's this sort of decline of democracy. Lots of people arguing to take the vote away, but among those people are some women suffragists, right? Like that they're also arguing that they're participating in
Absolutely.
it.
Yeah.
So I'm sort of wondering, like, how much of the women's suffrage movement in the post-schism period is built on that sort of declensionist rhetoric of taking the vote away from anti-immigration, anti-black, or is it can we just categorize it as part of this broader story of the democratization of America and the expansion of the vote, or are there is this a moment in which like the expansion of the vote is potentially and discursively and even ideologically built upon the decline of the vote for other people, like it was for white men in the Jacksonian period?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and it kind of is a little bit what you were asking. One of the things I do trace in the book is a distinction I see, and again, it's kind of this like Tocquevillian-Millian educative mode, which is different from another very, very prominent view, which is that suffrage should be educated, meaning that's prior to being enfranchised. Like, we only want the educated vote, so only people who are educated. The other version is saying the process is what educates you. So this is like kind of a rival set of discussions that I see within the movement in the late 1860s and 70s. That, it's not necessarily that the educated win out, but the educative don't win either. So there is that real debate within the movement. But we can see pieces of it as far back as Seneca Falls, actually. You can see some, there's that document takes umbrage that women, and they clearly mean white middle-class women, but they just say women. Women are not given votes that the most ignorant foreign men get. So you can see glimmers of it. But again, it's sort of like, I think the ideas are there, but then this culture is very hostile to democracy, and you learn how to shape arguments to fit a culture. And so I think, it's hard to sort out the context from the text in a way there, I think, because it does become, the last chapter traces all the different ways that democracy is kind of in erosion in public vocabulary and public discussion. And it's across movement people. And it's hard to say, maybe it's probably what they believe, but they also probably think it's a politically wise strategy to not be talking about it. Higginson's actually really great on this. He says, it used to be that we had this whole issue to combat, which was to show that women were fit. And now we have this whole other issue to combat, which is to say, democracy is a thing we used to like, and now we all hate it. So, so that's kind of the culture seemed to have shifted. And he's recognizing that sort of, so it's kind of hard to completely sort out, but I think it's interesting. And that's where I think thinking about published opinion, like of a mainstream opinion, it does become, these sort of contextual frames do become constraining in lots of ways. And you can make your very principled argument, but it's maybe not going to get in there, especially, this is not a social media world, it's just a media world. It may not, everything gets a little harder in the 19th century. It's harder, it's more difficult to make a more maybe humanitarian, non-social scientific or scientific-y kind of argument. But it's a great question. It's a great question apart from just thinking about the 1890s. It's just a great question to think about, I think, generally about how ideas and context work in tandem. Yeah.
Well, Leslie, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you so much for coming. Yeah, it's really fun. Thank you.
And thanks to all of you who are here in person or on YouTube with us this evening. If you'd like to recommend this program to friends, it will be available on our YouTube channel in the coming days, as are all of our public programs. We have a full slate of programs, in person and live streaming, this month and next. I'll just tell you about a few of them. Next Thursday, March 14th, Hannah Carlson will be talking about her book, Pockets, An Intimate History of How We Keep Things Close. The following Thursday, March 21st, author Barbara Weisberg will be here to talk about her new book, Strong Passions, A Scandalous Divorce in Old New York. You might have seen that reviewed in the New York Times last week. And on March 26th, Manisha Sinha will launch her new book, The Rise and Fall of the Second American Republic, Reconstruction 1860 to 1920, right here at AAS in conversation with John Stouffer. We've got a full slate of programs all the way through this spring, so please check out the AAS website, americanantiquarian.org, to find out about all of them. For now, thank you so much and have a good evening.